Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. It's an interesting time. That's my euphemism for what the heck is going on here. We are living in a time where civil discourse is at best difficult, at worst, well, watch the news. The problem seems to be that most people aren't learning this in schools anymore, what it means to have civics, civility, and learning how to connect with each other without necessarily having the disagreements that we have take over our lives. Interestingly enough, PRSA Delaware chapter was thinking about this very interesting scenario way back in January. And when we were setting our calendars for what programming we could bring our members, the first thing that came up was it's an election year and perhaps we need to really focus down on civil discourse. We just anticipated that there might be some difficulty with people trying to get their side of the political equation understood and yet not have it blow up into, well, anything else. So that's the reason for this program this evening. And we really appreciate you joining us because we feel the need to help communicators in every position, whether it be family, business, your own business, clubs, etc. Everybody is starting to work these opinions as we come closer to the election. And to that point, we were looking for just the right person to bring to the table that could help us understand how we can do civil discourse and talk amongst us with that civility. And we found that person. His name is David Dylan Thomas. He's an author. He wrote Design for Cognitive Bias. He is a content strategist, or basically what he calls the content strategy advocate for thinkcompany.com. He is an international speaker. And he says that his work, you'll find him somewhere in the intersection of social justice, bias, and design, because everything is designed in one way, shape, or form. His day job informs his hobbies. His hobby became his authorship. His authorship made him a speaker, and it goes on down the line. We're very fortunate to have David with us tonight. And if you have questions after his presentation this evening, please go out on the DETV Facebook page or the PRSA Delaware Facebook page and post your questions, and we'll see if we can't get to them at the end of the broadcast. David, how are you this evening?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to turn this over to you, and I give you our audience this evening. Help us to do discourse in a more civil fashion.
My pleasure. I'll just share my screen and we'll get started. So today we're going to talk about the content strategy of civil discourse and how you can turn conflict into collaboration. My name is David Dylan Thomas, content strategy advocate at Think Company, an experienced design firm. And I wrote a book called Design for Cognitive Bias that includes a lot of these ideas. But I want to start out by telling you about an experiment. And the experiment is you take an audience and you show them a photo like this and you ask them, should this person drive this car? And what you'll get is a policy discussion. And some people will say, oh, old people are bad at everything. Don't let them drive. And other people will say, that's ageist. How dare you? People should do what they want. All you're going to learn by the end of that discussion is who's on what side. Now you can show this exact same photo to another audience and ask them, how might this person drive this car? What you'll get is a design discussion. Some people will say, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we move the dashboard? What you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. It's the difference between the how conversation and the should conversation. And online and in daily life, we've gotten really good at the should conversation. But what I think we could get better at is the how conversation. Now, there's a guy, Robert Furch, who founded the Convergence Center for Public Policy, whose job is to really bring people from opposite sides of the table together. And when asked why he founded the organization, he said, over a period of years, I kept meeting people of great decency who had different worldviews, but there wasn't a place where they could meet up to bring out the best in each other and find answers that each hadn't considered. And there's a few phrases in what he said that I think are important. People of great decency. I think often when people disagree with us, we actually don't think they have great decency. Wasn't a place. The environments that we choose to have these conversations aren't really built for good conversations. And I'll go into more detail about that. Best in each other. Again, when we disagree with folks, we tend not to think there is a best to bring out in them. And finally, hadn't considered, right? I think we often enter into these conversations thinking we've already considered all of the angles. What more is there to learn? And I think that is a big mistake. Now, this is a shot from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. And Thunderdome is a gladiatorial arena in a post-apocalyptic future where people, two men enter, one man leave. Like you go there, this is how you settle disputes. And frankly, this doesn't feel that far off from what we witnessed last night. And today we think about political discourse as a zero-sum game. There has to be a winner, there has to be a loser, and that's it. Part of the reason we believe this is something called the fundamental attribution error. And it's a cognitive bias that plays out when you see somebody run a red light, right? You might assume, oh, that person is impatient, a terrible driver, they're dangerous, right? But if you run a red light, oh, I was late for work. I was in a hurry. Somebody was honking behind me. I got nervous, right? When somebody else does something, we attribute their behavior to something about them personally. When we do something, we attribute our behavior to our circumstances. And for some reason, it never occurs to us that that other guy might be late. Now, the You Are Not So Smart podcast did a version of this, and they introduced the concept using a pretty classic George Carlin routine that goes something like this. Anybody who drives slower than you is an idiot. Anybody who drives faster than you is crazy, right? And if you apply that thinking to political discourse, right? Well, anybody more conservative than me, oh, they're a bigot. They want it to be the 1950s. Anybody more liberal than me, oh, they're a hippie. They're crazy. They have no idea what's really going on. But you're God's perfect little creature, right? You've got it all figured out. And if only people would listen to you, everything would be okay. Now, if you imagine two people walking into a scenario, each having that attitude, no wonder they're not going to get anywhere. To put it another way, this is pretty much how we think about online discourse, right? And it's as if an alien were to come down and look at the way we use the web. The conclusion they would come to is, oh, the internet is where you go to find people who are doing it wrong and tell them they're doing it wrong. Now, surprisingly, this approach predates the current administration, right? If you go back to 2014, Slate put together a sort of weird advent calendar of all the outrage. And for every single day of the year, they were able to find something that Twitter was losing its mind over, right? And it's this really neat interaction where you click on one of these buttons and you get, hey, here's what people were freaking out on that day, right? But there's not a single day of the year you could not find outrage. And this is before the current political landscape. In fact, the John Olivers last week tonight created a website where you could literally yell something at the screen, type it in there, press scream, and the words would go tumbling in, right? This was an actual public service at the time. A great example of how this plays out is in the Race Together controversy. So before the most recent Starbucks controversy around race, we had the Race Together controversy where they were going to have baristas, when they gave you your coffee, there would be a little hashtag that said Race Together. And the idea was that the barista would then talk to you about Rodney King. I don't know what they actually thought was going to happen here. But what did happen was Twitter lost its mind, and rightly so. It was very tone deaf and weird. But at no point did anyone ask the question, well, what would a productive conversation about race look like? Like, what are we comparing this to, right? And if we were to ask that question, well, then maybe we can actually start to get to a place of saying, okay, well, how do we get there, right? Now, Rade Poloneshki is a reporter in Philadelphia, and she told a story about how in her travels, she started to understand that people really did, in fact, need to be heard. This was a fundamental human need. And so she kind of set up a situation where that conversation was in fact this thing she was supplying. She went out to an urban park in Philly and sat down with a sign that said, "I will listen with compassion, without judgment, with an open heart. So is there something you need to say? Tell me, I will listen." And person after person just kept sitting down and telling her their story. In fact, very often what would happen is someone would sit down and say, "I'm only going to take up a couple minutes of your time." And then like an hour later, right, they'd unburdened themselves. So there is a way to actually think about making this constructive. In fact, I remember going into a Starbucks once and someone had set up a sign in one of the booths that said, "I am a rabbi, ask me anything." I hope he was a rabbi, but that actually is a much more efficient approach to saying, let's have a conversation in a Starbucks. The point is, you get the conversation you design for. And I want to talk about some of the levers we can pull to design for better conversations. Now, one of the things we can actually think about is color. We've seen that in certain cultures, certain colors can actually influence the kind of conversation you get or the kind of mindset you're going to be in. There's an experiment where you have people perform tasks. And some of those tasks are very detail-oriented, like proofreading, and some of them are more creative, like brainstorming. And then they gave them different colored screens, different colored backgrounds when they were doing these tasks. And the people who got a red background, when they were proofreading, they found 30% more errors. People who had a blue background came up with twice as many ideas when they were brainstorming. So one of the things when you're designing a space that people are going to collaborate in is, what color do I really want people to be reacting to? Other elements in a room can actually influence our attitudes. There's experiments where you try to have a meeting, and if there's a briefcase in the room that's visible, people will act more competitive than if you were to replace that briefcase with, say, a backpack. And it's this notion that briefcases remind people of business, business makes people think of competition, and they actually start to act more competitively. And this can extend to web design as well. What kind of icons, right, are on your website? Are they encouraging people to be more collaborative or more competitive? Similarly, money. Anything that primes us to think about money primes us to actually be less social and more competitive. So just seeing dollar signs or even certain shades of green can bring that out in us. In fact, people reminded of money are less interpersonally attuned. They are not pro-social, caring, or warm. So think about that when you're trying to, design the room you want to have a collaboration in. Now, the idea that design would influence behavior shouldn't be that foreign to us. Think about going to a really nice restaurant back when that was something we could do. There's nice soft music playing and beautiful silverware, and there's the great decorations. This isn't the kind of place where you would feel appropriate to drop the F-bomb very loudly, right? That would seem weird. On the other hand, if you were in a dingy bar and there was loud music and it was kind of dirty, you might think this is a place that actively wants you to drop the F-bomb as loudly as possible, right? Now extend this to design. If you go to a website like Medium with its cool greens and blues and pristine typefaces, right? This doesn't seem like the kind of place to misbehave, right? It seems like you should really be bringing your A game if you try to comment here. If you look at a YouTube comment section or a Reddit comment section, it seems like they really don't care what you say, right? And the message it's sending is, we put the least amount of effort possible into how this place looks, so you should put the least amount of effort possible into how you conduct yourself. And I actually got to talk to somebody who works at Medium to see just how deliberate that was. And they were saying it's all very deliberate. In fact, when you are commenting on Medium, the button you press isn't post, it's publish. And even that word publish sounds a little more highfalutin, like, oh, I'm publishing something. Oh, this better be good. Another thing I want to talk about here is the idea of collaboration versus hierarchy, because these are the kinds of mindsets that can get us into fights or into working together. So hierarchy says that this is how it should be, and there should be no deviation, right? It's very fixed. It already knows the answer, and it is exclusive and non-learning, right? It's exclusive because if you think you already know how the world works, the only people out there are people who agree with you, who are in your group, and then anybody who disagrees with you, okay, they're the enemy, right? And it's non-learning, right? Because what's left to learn? We already know how the world works, how everything should be. What's to learn? Collaboration takes the opposite view and says that here is a problem we can solve together, right? And it searches continuously for better answers. It's never really satisfied. It's like, you know what, this is good. I bet we could do it even better, right? And it's inclusive because now If you see somebody, you don't think, are they the enemy or not? You think, hey, I bet they know something I don't know and they can contribute to helping us find the solution. And it is always learning, right? Because it's never completely found the answer. It knows it can always learn more. Now, the way we talk about race right now is very hierarchical. Basically, this is what happens, right? If somebody slips up, right? We rings the shame bell for them. And I want to be very clear here. We should call people out when they say hurtful things. There's no question about that. But what I want to talk about is the disadvantages of leaving it at that and not going any further. So one problem with this approach is that it treats noobs like trolls, right? When somebody says something offensive on, say, Twitter, it's not 100% clear all the time if they are being insensitive because they're just not very good at talking about race, or if they're literally trying to hurt somebody. Twitter tends to treat both of those categories exactly the same. And it kind of supposes that, oh, everybody is just born knowing how to talk about race, but talking meaningfully about race is a skill, right? And to get good at any skill, you need to practice. And Twitter allows no room for error. And when we practice, we make errors. The other problem is knowing how not to do something is not the same as knowing how to do it, right? So if I were trying to teach you how to drive a car, but the only thing I did was hit your hand every time you did something wrong, you would never learn how to drive that car, right? And the outrage ecosystem only knows how to tell you not to do something. Think of it this way. What is the opposite of a racist? For a long time, we really didn't have language for this. We're starting to use the term anti-racist at least, which I think is better than having nothing. But for a long time, we didn't even have the language for what we wanted, just for what we didn't want. And this makes a difference. I used to do a podcast with a friend of mine where we would talk about how race was depicted in different genres of film. And on a lark, I decided to Google what films might make me less racist. Here's what I got. A whole list of racist films, the exact opposite of what I was looking for. But just today, actually, I decided now that we have this term anti-racist and we have something to move towards instead of something to just move away from, what would happen? And it makes all the difference. When I Google what movies will make me more anti-racist, as opposed to what movies will make me less racist, I actually get what I'm looking for, right? Because we now have a name for what we want. That's very important. The point is, most of our content is should-oriented, not how-oriented. We want to tell you what not to do, but we're not really great at describing what we do want. And again, I want to emphasize, it's not that we should stop having the should discussions. This is very important. Reckoning needs to happen and is happening, but we need to understand what comes next. Because if all we do is shut people down, the best we can hope for is bureaucracy and people just trying to be safe, right? And be defensive and have fragility, right? We want more than that. Another problem with the focus just on what not to do is a concept called reactance. And it's the bias that's basically the you can't tell me what to do bias. Literally, if you have a wall and you write, please do not write on this wall, and you have a different wall that says, under no circumstances should you write on this wall, guess which wall is going to get the most graffiti, right? If you think about political correctness, it backfired because political correctness and constantly correcting you is catnip to reactance, right? That is the worst thing to say to somebody whose very, bias is based on you can't tell me what to do. It actually fetishizes the very words, right, that you're saying you shouldn't be saying. So what can we do, right? I would be remiss to sort of point out we need to be talking about the solutions and not the problems all the time and then not give you any solutions. The great news is there are so many solutions. One thing we can do is starting to call out good behavior, right? What are the best comment sections of the year, right? What's the best discourse or conversation that you've seen? Let's start elevating those. Let's have that top 10 list, because the more you celebrate something, the more you see of it, right? And people are competitive, right? If they see that somebody else got a nicer comment award, they're gonna be like, well, I can write a nicer comment than that. And my feeble attempt to do this a few years ago was a hashtag woke cinema, basically reacting to that Google list that I couldn't find anything that was sort of positive. I created this hashtag where every day I would just post a new movie that I thought was doing a good job of thinking constructively about race and gender. Now, As you can tell by ever looking up this hashtag, it was a complete failure. Nobody really caught on to it, but this was the beginning, for me at least, of trying to put more of that positive content out in the world. Another thing we can think about are these little interruptions we can do. One of them is called civil comments. And the whole idea is you have a comment section and you use this plugin, and when someone tries to comment, they can't actually post their comment until they've rated 3 other comments. And what this does is it A, forces them to recognize there is such a good thing as a good or a bad comment. B, it forces them to apply their own standard to that. And this is a very powerful thing, because if you tell me what to do, I might not obey. But if I tell me what to do and I say, hey, this makes this a good or a bad comment, but then I go back to my own comment and say, oh, wait, I'm doing the same thing, that cognitive dissonance isn't good for the soul, and I will probably go back and change my comment. And people who went through this process did, by and large, change their comments before they posted them. And finally, what it does is it lets me know, hey, if I'm reading somebody's comments, somebody's probably rating my comments, so I got to up my game. Now, sadly, civil comments is no more. It could not find a business model that worked. And I want to point that out because, as Chris Alfano, who helped co-found Code for Philly, said, we need more tools than there are business models for. Some of this stuff simply is a civic good that we need to make sure exists. Another great intervention like this was Rethink. So Trisha Prabhu was 14 years old when she first submitted this to the Google Science Fair, and it is brilliant. Basically, you're about to post something hateful to Twitter, and the AI kind of recognizes that, and when you hit send, it says, wait a minute, it seems like what you're about to send might be hurtful. Are you sure you want to send it, right? And she did her first round of experiments with adolescents, right? So these are people who literally like have very little impulse control, right? But even with this group, over 90% of the people who saw those 2 sentences didn't hit send, right? They stopped in their tracks and did not move forward. And this tells us a couple things. One, most of the people out there aren't evil. They're just thoughtless, right? As soon as you remind them that there's actually a human being on the other end of that communication, they actually stop in their tracks, even if they're adolescents. The other thing this tells us is it just takes 2 sentences to stop them, right? We're thinking it's the end of the world. 2 sentences, all right? From a 14-year-old, we can do this. Another thing we can think about is how we design the questions we ask when we're trying to have these discussions. So I was talking to you before about the Convergence Center. One of their secret weapons in getting people to the table is how they design questions. So let's say the issue is food deserts. You might ask, how can we get healthier food into the supermarket? Believe it or not, this is a very divisive question. What you could ask, and what they would ask, is how can we work together to shift consumer demand to healthier consumption? You see what they did there? They use a phrase like shift consumer demand. If I'm a marketer, right, or somebody who sells food, I'm going to zero in on that phrase because, wait a minute, if I'm shifting consumer demand, that means that is a white space. That's an open market that I can actually close in on before anybody else has a chance. Tell me more. How can I help? Healthier consumption. Okay, if I'm a health advocate, or maybe I live in that neighborhood and want healthier food for my kids, okay, I'm interested too. The point is, everybody on every side of this issue can see themselves in that question and has an interest in answering it. And the master stroke here is those first few words. How can we work together, right? You can't answer the question without first envisioning working together. In fact, let's go back to this question. How might this person drive this car? It's an okay question, but what if we were to ask, how do we do a better job of moving people? Because that's why that guy was in that car in the first place. He was here, but he wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, now things like public transportation are on the table. I actually saw this work in some client work I did for a pharmaceutical company, right? Where we had to establish what were the goals of this project. We were helping them with one of their websites. And to their credit, they didn't say, oh, our goal is to make money. They said, our goal is to improve health outcomes. And this was a very powerful statement because then it meant we could go back later to, let's say, the legal department. And one of the problems maybe was that it was taking like 6 months to make any little change to the website. And we could say, hey, legal department, what do you think your job is? And they could say, well, you know, to keep us from getting sued. And I could say, okay, but remember when we said the goal was to improve health outcomes? Now, we can't do that if we're sued, but we also can't do that if it takes 6 months to post any changes. So work with me here, right? settling on those goals can be a powerful way to bring people to the table. Another thing we need to think about is creating platforms that are better for having these conversations. What we've got now isn't necessarily the best. A lot of our reactions these days are really just binary, right? But they're not really about solving anything. There's an exercise that I do when I'm in person with people, like back when that was a thing, that was aimed at trying to actually come up with new ideas. And it's called 8 Up. And the basic idea is you have, let's say, 8 people in a room, and you say to each of those people, okay, here's the question we're trying to solve. Let's say it's that, how do we do a better job of moving people around? Each one of you write down 3 ideas. You've got 3 minutes, write down 3 ideas for how we can do a better job of moving people around. People write down their ideas. 3 minutes are up, great. Turn to your neighbor, show them your 3 ideas. They're going to show you their 3 ideas. Take those 6 ideas and whittle them down to 2. You've got 10 minutes, go, right? 10 minutes are up. You got pairs of people with 2 ideas each. Great. Turn to the pair next to you, show them your 2 ideas. They will show you their 2 ideas. Take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 2. And you can kind of see where this is going, right? By the end, you have 8 people. They've got 4 ideas. Take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 1. And that one idea you'll find is very powerful. And they've seen in research, this is better than saying, hey, 8 people, I'm going to lock you in a room. Don't come out till you've got a good idea. You get a mediocre idea. Or, hey, 8 people come up with ideas. We're going to vote on the best one. You get a mediocre idea. This way, by progressively adding people's ideas, you get the DNA of everybody in the room, right? And if anybody's kind of a loud talker, they don't really get to overpower the room until the very end. All of these are ways of overcoming the biases we run into when we try to come up with good ideas. This is a time-tested approach. In fact, the Netflix prize, where this is several years ago, Netflix said, we'll give you $1 million if you can improve our algorithm for recommendations by 10%. The winning team was actually a combination of 2 different teams who combined their ideas. And even the second place team was also a combination of 2 teams who combined their ideas. So this is literally $1 million approach to collaboration. I've been thinking a lot about, is there a way to take that exercise and do it digitally? And I think V-Taiwan is getting there. So the backstory on V-Taiwan, V as in Victor, V-Taiwan is that Taiwan was having a very similar political crisis to what we see in Hong Kong right now. There was a tax law that was going to give China much more power over Taiwan. And there were all these protests over it. But instead of turning, the hoses on the protesters, the government said, hey, protesters, do you want to work with us? Can we actually have one of you, your leader, come in and actually have a cabinet post that's specifically around this collaboration? And they said yes. And so they developed this process called V-Taiwan. And the basic idea is you start out with a premise, right? Something you're working on. Let's say, for example, ride sharing, right? So folks like Uber, which was actually a problem they tackled. And you put out all these different statements, like maybe people who do ride sharing, who are actually driving these cars, should have a license to do that, right? And then you have people react to that statement. The key is, instead of having, oh, here's the statement, put your reply here, they got rid of the reply button. The only thing you could do when you saw that statement was agree, disagree, or pass. Now, this is a genius chess move, right? If you remove the reply button, think about what happens to trolls. If I'm a troll and what I want to do is get a rise out of you by writing some awful reply to your statement, I can't, there's no reply button. Or if I want to post something horrible just to see all the outraged replies, I can't, there's no reply button. And in fact, people could propose their own statements after seeing this, but again, that proposal was disconnected, right, from these statements, so it had to stand on its own. What this did was it incentivized consensus and added friction to trolling. So people would, in fact, come up with their own statements, which would kind of further the conversation. And then the other thing they did, which was, again, a genius move, was you could really only see who agreed with what at a very 1,000-foot level, right? So you could see a statement and see the groups of people who agreed with it or disagreed with it, right? And eventually you would start to see things where this group or that group might agree. But over time, you would see things that all of the groups agreed with. So again, going back to the example of Uber, right? You might start out with Uber drivers, Uber passengers, taxi drivers, and taxi passengers as 4 distinct groups. But you would start to see statements that maybe 2 of these groups would agree with, and they might start to merge into one group. And so by the time you got to that final round, it was really just pro-Uber and anti-Uber. And then you would start to see statements that even both of those groups agreed with. And the key here is, if you want to find statements that multiple groups agree with, they can't be these extremist polarizing statements. They have to actually be very nuanced. So let me give you an example. We should introduce the same 5-star rating system to order taxis, because the thing that ensures Uber's quality is its rating system. It is not anything else. So if the government mandates all the independent taxis and fleets to introduce the same system, we can get the same quality, and then Uber doesn't become a problem. This was a statement that all of the groups, pro-Uber and anti-Uber, agreed with. And you'll notice it's actually a pretty nuanced statement. So we're encouraging nuance and discouraging extremist statements, polarizing statements. And in fact, this got turned into policy. That's the whole point of V-Taiwan, is to create statements that can then be turned into policy. And ultimately what Taiwan did was basically put the Uber technology in taxis, right? Now imagine our Congress, right, coming up with a solution that nuanced, or your local city council, or Twitter, or Facebook comment threads coming up with something this nuanced. This is not easy. This takes really good design acumen, right? This is a very carefully designed process, but it was designed specifically to arrive at these kinds of solutions that people could collaborate and reach consensus on. The current things we have, like Twitter and Facebook, aren't designed for this at all. They're really just kind of designed to get people to yell at each other because, well, it's kind of how they make money. So I think this is a story we need to pay a lot more attention to. And it echoes those sentiments I was talking about before around treating our differences as a resource, right? If I see someone else, I don't say they're the enemy. I say they might have knowledge I need, right? And not focusing on defeating an opponent, but rather integrating their piece of truth, right? The really succinct way he put it, which I love, is it's the difference between generating winners and generating wisdom. Another great area around this is something called problem-based procurement. So procurement is the process by which, right, you get, new mailboxes or repaved roads or whatever. You're basically contracting to do something for your city. And usually the way this works is, let's say we need new street lights. Okay, here's a 50-page RFP with all the different specs for the street lights, and it has to be this tall and this many of them use this much power and blah, 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 blah. And you have the same 5 people bid on it, as always bid on it, and you go with the cheapest solution. Problems-based procurement says, it's dark at night, we need to see, go, right? Now they haven't outlined the exact solution, and now you have the option for more creative solutions, and more people get to play. And if it turns out, hey, the most cost-efficient, effective solution is to give everybody night vision goggles, that's what we'll do, right? But it opens it up in a way that the traditional approach doesn't. I want to walk you through a case study that kind of shows you how all these different dynamics can help people collaborate. So true story, friend of mine, we're going to call her Frances. Frances facilitates meetings where people decide how to distribute millions in federal funding for at-risk populations in a major metropolitan city. And as you can imagine, these are very fraught conversations. And what's happening in these conversations is status quo bias. People are just spending the money the same way they did the year before and the year before that. And as long as the problems stay exactly the same, that's good. But the problem is needs shift. And where this area needed more funding in year 1, this other area might need funding in year 2. But if you keep funding it the way you did in year 1, these needs aren't going to be met. So Frances and her team started to rethink the agenda. The old agenda for these meetings was the people would get a big, massive document. And there would be walks through that document, and there would be a Q&A where nobody asked any questions because they were just handed this giant document. And then there would be a working lunch where people were trying to do the budgeting while they ate. The new agenda started with a budget-free document. And remember, when people are reminded of money, they become less pro-social. And when you're trying to do things for an at-risk group, right, pro-social is the thing you want. And before they had the meeting, they did some data training with the attendees so they understood how to look at these graphs and they could really engage with them. So when it came time for question and answers, there were actual questions because people felt comfortable engaging with that content. Then they would go through a version of that 8-up exercise I told you about, where they would break into groups and start to agree on, okay, what are the biggest needs here? And then once they had agreed on those needs, they sorted those needs into money needs versus non-money needs, because again, not every need can actually be solved with money. This was an important distinction. Then they would do a non-working lunch, because you do not want people making decisions on an empty stomach. There's an actual thing called decision fatigue, and it's super scary because it actually affects, let's say, judges. If you have a judge go through the day, right, and they're making decisions about, let's say, who to let go, who to give parole or not, their decisions become more and more harsh the closer you get to lunch and the further you get away from their last break. Then after lunch, they suddenly become more favorable again, and then they start shrinking. So if you're ever up for parole, pray you don't do it before lunch. But the point is, hanger is real, and people will make decisions differently depending on if they actually have the energy to make those decisions thoughtfully. So feed your people. So after people had eaten, then finally they started talking about dollars and cents and making budget decisions. But that wasn't the only change they made. They also looked at the space they were having the meetings in. One of the problems was there were too many chairs. It was hard to move around. And when it's hard to move around, people feel less creative when they don't feel like they have the freedom to move. They had these really nice big windows, but it was difficult to sit next to them, and light makes a difference. It was very lecture style seating, which isn't very good for collaboration. And there's no real green space, right? And the main thing is it didn't really feel like a space that was used by human beings. Have you ever been in one of those meeting rooms that feels like it was built for robots, really? So they read a book by Ingrid Fattal Lee called Joyful. And one of the things it talks about is how the design of a space can affect the mood of the people in that space. And they started making some changes. First off, they realized, hey, maybe 50 people come to this meeting and we have 100 chairs. Let's get rid of 50 chairs, right? And now there's more room to move around. And they can give people access to those areas of big light and maybe put some nice chairs there where you can kind of maybe sit and chat before and after the meeting. And they went to a more semicircular chair arrangement, right? So people are facing each other a little more. And they put plants in the room, right? Little touches like that actually bring some life to the conversation. And my favorite touch was there was a coat rack in the back of the room that nobody ever used, because who puts a coat rack in the back of the room? They moved to the front of the room where it was practical, but then they seated it with like their own work sweaters. So when people came in, they already saw it was being used. And so they felt like, oh yeah, I'll use this. And the magic of the coat rack is just that it made the space feel like a place that was used by humans, right? And that makes a difference when people need to make very important but very human decisions about money. And as a matter of fact, right, after making these changes, people started shifting the budget to the places where the need was, not just where they'd used the budget the year before. And people would show up early and leave late and get to know each other, right? Which again, made it easier to make these high tension decisions. So all of these factors make a difference in whether or not we're really collaborating or just going through the motions. Marvelous technology is at our disposal, and instead of reaching up for new heights, we try to see how far down we can go. This is from Talk Radio, Eric Bogosian movie from the 80s. He was talking about radio, but we might as well be talking about the internet. So I'm going to propose 3 rules of productive discourse that we can use to try to, make things better going forward. Number 1, neither of us has the answer, right? If we did, we wouldn't be having this conversation in the first place because the problem would have been solved by now. 2, neither of us will win. This is really hard. We're trained to think that everything is zero-sum and that we need to be fighting. But winning doesn't really solve anything. All winning really does is make one of us feel good until the problem rears its ugly head again because we were too busy winning to actually solve it. Finally, we are here to create something new. This assumes the best in each of us and that we both have something to contribute to a better tomorrow. So the next time you see somebody doing it wrong, ask yourself if there's a how conversation to be had. Thank you.
That was awesome, David. It makes things so clear. Let me again just say who you are in case people have joined us late. This is David Dylan Thomas. He wrote a book on cognitive bias that has lent itself to our discussion today about civil discourse. All of it comes together. His book is called Design for Cognitive Bias, and PRSA Delaware is bringing him to you so that you can understand that this is not a new problem. This has been around a long time. What is new is that there are different eyes on it and there's new thought being put around it. Let me once again tell you, I'm Lori Jensen. I am the president of PRSA Delaware, and this is being brought as a service to our membership and to others who need to communicate in this time that's fraught with all kinds of, let's just say, emotion. David, we have some questions coming in, but I wanted to ask you first, if I could, from the design perspective, thinking about last night's debate, how would you have designed that stage?
So one thing I would definitely have had is just a clock. Like, think about a game. I kept thinking about game shows when I watched the debate, and the debate's structured very much like a game show. You have this much time to answer a question. Like, that's literally how game shows work, right? The last part of Jeopardy is like, you've got this much time to answer the question, and then time's up, right? A countdown clock, and then your mic gets cut off, right? Like, you can't say there are rules and then not enforce the rules. And, you know, not to put too a fine point on it, but this administration, perhaps more than previous ones, has demonstrated that if you don't enforce the rules, people will do what they want. And that's exactly what you saw last night. If you don't enforce the rules, people are just going to keep going until you enforce them. So a countdown clock, the ability to turn off the mic if you want, right? There's any number of just simple tools you can apply that allow you to control, right, your speakers a little more.
But how do people react to having that feeling of being controlled in what is basically, like you said, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome? To enter, one's supposed to leave. We know we have a president who believes in winning at all costs. How does that come together?
So I think that actually is the more fundamental problem. Even the nature of the questions being asked. There was one question that was something along the lines of, tell me why you're right and why your opponent is wrong. Like, literally. And if you think of the rules I just laid out, that goes completely counter, right, to that concept. And if the point of the debate is to accentuate the differences between the candidates, honestly, having them just give speeches about what they believe in is a far better way to understand the differences. The debate theoretically is supposed to help you understand how good they are taking, challenging each other maybe, or talking to each other. But honestly, the way that we structure debates doesn't really give us that. It either gives them the opportunity to yell at each other or just give talking points, right? So I don't think, even before you talk about the way the stage is structured or the way that, the graphics you could be using, you really have to talk at that fundamental level of, well, what questions are you asking and what is even the goal of this debate? And are the questions you're asking actually getting you any closer to that goal?
I don't know if that was given much thought based upon what I saw last night. So let's take it out of the political arena for a second and try to put the environment that we're currently in, thanks to that discussion, and bring it into more of a communications professionals type of, venue, if you will. So now we have people who are on edge. I don't know anybody in the population, unless you're a hermit and just, not turning on TV at all or have one. It's an edgy time. So we need to, as you said, build collaboration from conflict. And it seems as though it's juxtaposed. You gave 3 rules. That's fine. It's a good starting point. But how do you bring people to the table to start those rules in action?
I think you need to have an intriguing question. I mean, again, I think the work of the Convergence Center kind of points to this of saying, okay, I've got to get, marketers who are going to win if they can gouge prices, right, for food, and health advocates who are trying to feed people in the city, and who are going to win if relatively expensive produce is something that they can get cheaply, right? These seem like diametrically opposed situations. So I need a question. I need a frame. It's called the framing effect. I need a frame where each one of those parties can see an advantage in being a part of that conversation and in actually collaborating. You need to give people something to look at and want to be a part of solving, rather than saying, here is a prize, right, that only one of you can win. And it's going from the prize frame to this, hey, here's something where if we solve it, everybody wins. So it's tricky, right? Because and again, you look at that, that question about how might we shift consumer demand? Like, I don't think they came up with that overnight, right? There were some people working some hours to come up with that question. But if you can come up with that question, all of a sudden now people are in a mindset where they feel like it's in their best interest to be a part of that conversation. And they actually kind of want to work together.
When there's that dichotomy of people who want to work together versus those that are just absolutely not going to do it, there has to be a design behind that as well. And I mean, recommendations for how to deal with that, because we do run into that. We run into people who are just so married to their points of view or their perspective or opinion that it's almost impossible or we think it's almost impossible. So is this the strategy part of you I'm really appealing to?
No, yeah, totally. And I think that one of the things you have to ask yourself is my goal to change this person's opinion, or is my goal to change this person's behavior? And I'll give you an example. Have you heard the phrase, don't mess with Texas?
Oh, yeah.
Do you know where that phrase comes from?
I don't think I do.
I didn't either. It is an anti-littering campaign. For real.
Oh,
so
yeah.
For a while, the Texas highways were horrible, right? And they tried campaign after campaign to get people to just stop littering. But what they finally settled on, right, was the phrase, don't mess with Texas. And the genius of that phrase is it takes the behavior of littering and turns it into something anti-Texan. And if there's one thing all Texans can agree on, is that Texas is awesome. Probably be its own country. Maybe is its own country, right? Everybody can agree on that. So if you can tie the behavior of not littering to keeping Texas awesome, there it is, right? I can change your behavior by appealing to something you already believe in. Now, you could have just as easily tried to invest that time into turning every good old boy in Texas into an environmentalist, and maybe eventually you could have gotten there. But it took less time to simply get people to change their behavior because they decided that was more important than trying to convince everybody to become an environmentalist. Now, maybe by doing that, people are 1% closer to becoming an environmentalist, but the goal there was pretty explicitly, I just want to change your behavior. I don't think I'm going to convince you overnight to change your beliefs, right? Changing your beliefs is a much bigger ask.
Doing this on a personal level in our families, in our places of business, it's more of that one-to-one question and answer, try to find the common ground and then move on from there. But we deal with mass communication. So what does that look like? How do we build that platform?
Sure. I mean, I think that, sorry, just sort of clarify, like what about the mass communication?
How do you bring people to this conflict to collaboration on a mass communication level? Have you thought of a way? Is there a design for it? Are there stepping stones that we could use?
So I think we know the answer in a lot of ways. And the reason we haven't seen it at a mass level is that there's not much economic incentive behind it. So V Taiwan could work here. We could take the reply button off Facebook tomorrow. Trisha Prabhu's thing works. I mean, it's been shown, it's been demonstrated to work. Twitter could implement it tomorrow. But part of the reason we don't see these things scaling right now is because the business model, frankly, kind of gets off on conflict. And what's really ironic about that is that it's a flawed business model, right? It's a bubble. There's a great article that came out a few years ago, or I think it was just last year, talking about how basically the online advertising bubble is just that. It's a bubble. There's no actual evidence that drawing eyeballs and engagement to ads is actually resulting in higher sales for any of these particular products. All it's really doing is making like that the people who are trying to sell those ads, right, get rich. And it's not that there isn't evidence out there, but all the evidence so far has shown that like selection effects for, let's say, Google ads aren't necessarily moving the needle any more than just the organic results. So the real sad irony is that all this effort being put into selling our data, right, so that you can show us more ads, isn't even necessarily a bona fide way of making money. And it might be like the housing bubble. That might be a big crash coming. But the point is, I think we could scale these things very easily, but right now there's no like economic powerhouse behind making that happen. And it would probably take a good deal of money to make a platform like that spread to billions of people.
So, and this is maybe a little out there, but what you're saying that we need to incentivize people in some way, shape, or form to have them leave the conflict model behind and work more toward the collaborative model?
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know if that's going to take that much incentive, right? I think it's more you would have to incentivize Facebook to abandon its business model, right? Which is probably a pretty big ask, right? Yeah. And honestly, I don't know if that looks more like a generational thing where you don't have quite as many young people on Facebook. You don't have quite as many young people on Twitter, right? And you have people, kind of finding their own platforms that are less conflict oriented because they never had that much of a taste for it to begin with, right? Or they found what they saw happening somewhat distasteful. I'll give you an example. So Dana Boyd talks about how Facebook is really complicated because imagine being in a room with your parents, your teacher, your kids, and your friends all at the same time. It's very awkward, but that's exactly what it is. If you post something, it's just as likely that your sister will comment, your friend will comment, your teacher, like anybody you're friends with, right? It's just not a great situation. What you want is a little more of a closed system for who you're talking to. And as I heard that, I'm like, oh man, whoever invents that is going to make a killing. And then I saw a panel of Gen Zers. Like this was a little panel, literally a panel of 13-year-olds talking about their lives. And one of the things that the kids said was, oh, so I used to be at this old school with my friends. And we had this text chain. And then I went to this new school and I started a new text chain. And I realized, hey, my friends from the old school would really like these new friends. So I just made one big text chain. And I'm like, oh my God, someone's already invented the killer app. It's called texting. Right? We've had this technology for longer than there's been Facebook. Like this is a solved problem, right? But we didn't see it because we're so in love with all these social gadgets that came up that were new for us. Whereas people who were born into it were like, yeah, I'm just going to text. Can I just not talk to all these other people? Right? So I think that that's my hope, at least, is that the faster path than trying to unseat Facebook by, raising $2 billion in venture capital and starting my new social media company is that the upcoming generation kind of builds their own version, which is actually better because they can see through the malarkey because they were born into it. I don't know, that's my hope at least. But yeah, I think that is kind of what I'm saying, is that it's not even incentivizing that new approach of going from binary conflict world to, inclusive collaborative world. It's more just saying if the tools are there, we will use them. And right now they're not, because there's just not so much money in having them be there.
So we have about 2 minutes left, and let's just take this one right out of the sky. If you had a magic wand, David, and could change one thing, what is it?
So this is going to sound a little off topic, but I promise I'll bring it back. I would make it so that for 1 year, all women and people of color were paid twice as much as their white male counterparts in whatever job they had. Let me tell you why I think that would make a difference. Remember I was saying before about economic incentives and how money kind of accelerates things? I think that women and people of color have been on the business end of the results of these conflicts more so necessarily than their white male counterparts or more than white supremacy in general. And so they have more of a built-in incentive to use that money to build the world that they want, right? And part of the reason it is difficult to build the world that you want is the world we want is pretty expensive, right? Any world you want to build is pretty expensive. But once you shift that economic power to people who have been marginalized, victimized, and say, okay, well, you spend the money now. Okay, maybe we see some different people get elected. Maybe we see some different policies. Maybe we see money shift to different companies who are being more inclusive. Maybe we start to see jobs open up, right, for people who don't usually get those kinds of jobs. So you're basically shifting power. Let's shift power for a year. Just see what happens, right? And I think even that, even if it goes right back to normal after, and the pay scale changes right after, yeah, I've had a year to save up quite a bit of money, right? At scale for these communities that have been marginalized. And I think that actually can move the needle on collaborative discourse, because honestly, collaborative discourse is more beneficial for people who are marginalized. Conflict is more beneficial for people who have power. So that's why I would pick that one thing. If I had to wave a magic wand, it'd probably be that.
Well, that's brilliant. I'd like to see that happen, actually.
Yeah.
Turn the tables. What the heck? David, I can't thank you very much. Thank you more than I have already, but I'm going to say thank you very much for being here this evening to talk to people about this. It couldn't have come at a better time. I think that a lot of people have been smarting and are still smarting. If I'm reading my social media streams, and before I went to bed last night, I checked Twitter, and I still had to get up and walk around for 20 minutes. That was something else. So yours is a model that we can really dig into. I really recommend your book. Again, The Design for Cognitive Bias, and this is attached to that. So get the book, read as much as you possibly can. And if I may, for those of you who are communications professionals out watching this right now, I invite you to join Public Relations Society. Delaware chapter is very active. We love producing programs like David's this evening so that we can come to the table and be collaborative and find ways of helping you to do the same. Check us out on Facebook. We're available, and you'll get my phone number if you just ask for it. So we'd be glad to talk with you. David, all the best. Hope to have you back again. And thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Have a good night, everyone.